Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to see someone from your past, someone who meant so much to you, living a life you never expected? Could you recognize them in an unexpected situation? How would you react? These were the exact questions Park Bo-gum found himself asking as he walked down a busy street in Seoul one crisp winter afternoon. Park Bo-gum had always been a man of routine, his life planned out and predictable. He had grown accustomed to the pace of his successful career and his busy schedule, but that day, something seemed different. As he was walking to meet a friend at a cafe, his mind wandered. He wasn't thinking about the meeting or even about his work. His thoughts lingered on something much more personal, much more significant. His first love. He had not seen her in years. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions, and for a while, he had almost forgotten the feelings he had once had. But even the most distant memories have a way of resurfacing at the most unexpected moments. As he walked, Park Bo-gum's thoughts drifted to her bright smile, her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled whenever she talked about her dreams. Back then, he had been certain they would be together forever. The memories flooded back to him, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped. He could see her face in his mind so clearly, and it felt as though no time had passed. But then, just as he rounded the corner and was about to cross the street, he saw something, a figure sitting on the cold pavement, wrapped in tattered clothes. The person held a small, worn-out cup in their hands, asking for spare change. At first, Park Bo-gum thought it was just a stranger, someone in need of help, but as he took a closer look, his heart stopped. The figure was a woman, and there was something about her that seemed hauntingly familiar. For a brief moment, he hesitated, wondering if he was imagining things, but then it clicked. His mind raced. No, this couldn't be real. Could it? He was standing in front of her, the woman who had once meant everything to him. The girl he had loved so deeply. He had not seen her in years, and yet, the sight of her now was almost too overwhelming to process. His first instinct was to rush to her, to speak to her, but his feet felt as though they were frozen to the ground. How could this be happening? After all these years, was this really her? Is it really you? He whispered under his breath, barely able to believe the words as they left his mouth. His voice trembled, and his hands shook as he slowly stepped closer. The woman raised her eyes, and when their gazes met, a mix of shock, disbelief, and recognition passed between them. It was a fleeting moment, but for that brief second, everything around them seemed to disappear. The noise of the busy street, the bustling crowds, the passing cars, it all faded into the background. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and surprise. The years had clearly changed her. She looked worn, tired, and the glow that once defined her had faded. But even so, there was something undeniably familiar about her, something that made his heart ache with memories of their past. Her voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. Park Bo-gum, she asked, her words barely audible over the noise of the city. Her face was gaunt, and the weariness in her eyes was impossible to ignore. She barely looked like the woman he once knew, the woman who had filled his days with joy, laughter, and dreams for the future. But there she was, sitting on the cold pavement, a stranger in her own right, yet still so familiar to him. His heart felt as though it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Was this really happening? Was this really the girl he had loved? How had she ended up here, in this situation? His mind raced with questions, none of them making any sense. What happened? He asked softly, unable to hold back the flood of emotions that were now threatening to overwhelm him. Her gaze dropped to the ground, as if ashamed of what she had become, of the life she was now living. I never thought you'd recognize me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a sadness in her tone that Park Bo-gum couldn't ignore. She looked down at her hands, which were clenched tightly around the cup she was holding. For a moment, there was only silence between them, and the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. Park Bo-gum felt his chest tighten. This wasn't the girl he had once known, the girl who had been full of life and laughter. This was someone else, someone who had been broken by the world. The life she had lived after they parted ways had clearly been difficult, and the truth of it hit him hard. He never expected to find her like this, not in a million years. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his, and her face softened slightly. There was a faint, sad smile on her lips. Life doesn't always turn out the way we expect, does it? She asked, her voice filled with resignation. But I never forgot you, Park Bo-gum. Even in all this time, I never forgot what we had. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment all along, hoping that one day, he would come back into her life. And here he was, standing before her, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do. All he knew was that seeing her like this shattered him. Park Bo-gum stood there, looking at her, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't quite explain. He wanted to help, to reach out, but the words wouldn't come. The shock of seeing her again, in such a different and heartbreaking situation, was overwhelming. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could things have turned out this way? What had happened to the vibrant, hopeful girl he had once known? He took a step forward, and without thinking, he gently reached out his hand to touch her shoulder. She flinched, but then looked up at him with those familiar eyes that had once held so much hope. Now, they seemed dull, haunted. The spark that used to shine there was barely a flicker. How did this happen? Park Bo-gum asked, his voice trembling with concern. He was still trying to understand what had brought her to this point. Where did everything go wrong? She looked away, her gaze drifting to the ground as if she was afraid to meet his eyes. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. He could feel the weight of her pain in the air between them, and it was suffocating. It wasn't just the past that haunted her, it was everything that had come after. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered, barely audible over the bustling noise of the street. I had dreams. I had plans. I thought we'd be together, but life had other ideas. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and Park Bo-gum could see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The pain she carried was evident, and the memories of their time together, the dreams they had shared, the promises they had made, now felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who had been lost, drifting through life without direction. I never wanted to leave you, she continued, her voice filled with regret. I didn't want any of this to happen, but sometimes life just takes you down a path you never expected. Park Bo-gum's heart ached as he listened to her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always been the one who was able to overcome obstacles, to keep going no matter how hard things got. But now, standing in front of her, he realized just how different her journey had been. She hadn't had the same opportunities, the same support, and the world had not been kind to her. I've heard things, Park Bo-gum admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I never imagined you'd end up like this. Her eyes snapped up to meet his, a flash of anger and hurt crossing her face. And what did you hear? She asked sharply. Did you hear that I was worthless? That I didn't deserve to live? Because that's how it feels sometimes, Park Bo-gum. Like I'm just invisible, like I'm nothing. The words stung, and Park Bo-gum took a step back, not sure how to respond. This wasn't the girl he had known. The girl who had laughed with him, shared their dreams and secrets, was gone. But deep down, he knew she was still there, buried beneath the pain and the bitterness that life had forced upon her. I never thought of you that way, Park Bo-gum said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. I don't know what happened, but I do know that you're not invisible. Not to me. For the first time, her expression softened. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read him. Trying to see if he meant what he was saying. I don't know if I can go back, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can ever be the person I was before. The world has changed me, and I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore. Park Bo-gum's heart ached for her, for all the pain she had gone through. He wanted to take away her suffering, to make things right again. But he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Healing took time, and it required more than just words. Maybe it's not about going back, he said gently. Maybe it's about moving forward. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, just a brief glimmer, but it was enough to make his heart swell with hope. Maybe this was the start of something new, a second chance for both of them. A chance to rebuild what they had lost. I don't know if I deserve your help, she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. I don't know if I can trust again.
You don't have to know, Park Bo-gum replied, his voice firm and steady.
You don't have to have it all figured out right now. We'll take it one step at a time.
She looked at him for a long time, as if weighing his words.
Then, slowly, she nodded.
It wasn't a promise, but it was a step forward.
And that was enough for now.
The days that followed felt like a blur. Park Bo-gum was determined to help her, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The first step was getting her out of the street, giving her some sense of safety and stability. But he also knew that simply providing for her wouldn't be enough. She needed to heal, to rediscover herself, and that would take time that he was more than willing to give. He arranged for her to stay in a small apartment that he had found for her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She hesitated at first, unsure of accepting his help, but he reassured her that this was just the beginning of something new. You don't have to be afraid, he said gently, as he helped her settle in.
I'm here for you. No one else has to know if you don't want them to.
She nodded silently, overwhelmed by the kindness he was showing her. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and safe. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of security, something she hadn't felt in years. But as Park Bo-gum left her alone to settle in, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she wasn't telling him. Her eyes had revealed so much pain, and he knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. She had to confront her demons and face the things that had pushed her to this point. Over the next few weeks, Park Bo-gum visited her regularly. He helped her with small tasks, like shopping for groceries and arranging furniture in the apartment. They shared stories, laughed, and even shed some tears together. It was a slow process, but with each passing day, she seemed to come back to life a little more. Her smile, though still tinged with sadness, began to return. Yet, as much as she was changing, there were still moments when the weight of her past seemed to overtake her.
Park Bo-gum could see the cracks in her confidence, the self-doubt that lingered beneath the surface.
There were nights when she would shut herself off from him, retreating into the quiet solitude of her apartment, and Park Bo-gum would quietly leave, unsure of how to break down the walls she had built around herself. One evening, after a particularly quiet visit, Park Bo-gum sat in his car outside her apartment building, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. What more could he do? How could he make her believe that she was worthy of love, of a second chance? As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from her. "I'm sorry," it read. "I don't think I can do this." His heart dropped into his stomach. Was she giving up already? Had she already decided that she wasn't worth saving? Without a second thought, Park Bo-gum jumped out of the car and rushed to her apartment. He knocked on the door with urgency, not sure what he was going to say but knowing he couldn't let her slip away again. When she opened the door, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was something else, something that made his heart ache fear. "I'm not going anywhere," Park Bo-gum said, his voice steady but filled with emotion.
"I'm not giving up on you. Don't give up on yourself."
She looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. And then, for the first time in weeks, she let out a deep sigh, and the wall she had been so carefully building began to crumble. "I don't know how to trust anymore," she whispered.
"Everything I've known has fallen apart. How do I fix that?"
Park Bo-gum gently reached out and took her hands in his.
"You don't have to fix it alone. We'll do this together. We'll figure it out. One step at a time."
Her tears began to flow, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself cry, let herself feel the weight of everything she had been carrying. Park Bo-gum held her, not saying anything, just letting her cry, knowing that sometimes, words weren't enough. All she needed was someone to be there, to remind her that she wasn't alone. "I'll be here, every step of the way," he whispered softly, his voice full of conviction. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself believe him. The days that followed felt like a slow but steady transformation. Park Bo-gum's presence in her life had brought something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The walls she had built around herself began to crack, piece by piece. It wasn't an overnight change, but every small step was a victory. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think that perhaps she could heal. One of the first things Park Bo-gum did was help her reconnect with the things that had once brought her joy. He had noticed her sketchbook sitting quietly in the corner of her apartment, filled with old drawings and unfinished projects. He encouraged her to pick it up again, to allow herself to dream in ways she hadn't done in so long. "Do you remember how much you used to love drawing?" he asked one evening as they sat together in the living room. "It's still there inside you. You just need to let it out." At first, she hesitated. The idea of picking up where she left off seemed too daunting. How could she return to something that had once been so important to her, something that now seemed so far away from the person she had become? But Park Bo-gum's encouragement was unwavering. Slowly, she began to draw again. The lines were hesitant at first, but as she lost herself in the art, she began to rediscover the passion she had once felt. It was a small thing, but it felt like a breakthrough. Every sketch, every stroke of the pencil was a step forward, a reclaiming of the person she had been before life had knocked her down. As the weeks passed, Park Bo-gum continued to be her constant support. He would check in with her daily, bringing her small gifts, things that reminded her of the good times they had shared when they were young. They would take walks together in the park, and though the conversations were sometimes awkward, the connection between them was growing stronger. It wasn't about rushing, it was about being there for each other, at a pace that felt right for both of them. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when the pain from her past threatened to overtake her progress. There were days when she would withdraw, isolating herself in the quiet of her apartment, afraid to face the world outside. On those days, Park Bo-gum would be there, patiently waiting for her to open up, never pushing too hard but always ready to listen. One evening, after an especially difficult day, she found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the city. The lights of Seoul flickered in the distance, and for a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the weight of everything. How had she ended up here? Was she really capable of turning her life around? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Park Bo-gum, as always, there to check on her. He had brought dinner with him, a simple meal, but one that spoke volumes about how much he cared. "How are you doing?" he asked as he set the food on the table. She looked up at him, her expression filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I'm trying, but some days, it feels like I'm not getting anywhere." Park Bo-gum sat down beside her, offering her a reassuring smile. "It's okay to feel that way. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a process, and sometimes it takes time." "But what if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What if I can't do it?" "You're strong enough," he replied firmly, his voice steady. "You've already made so much progress. You just need to believe in yourself the way I believe in you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so long doubting herself, convincing herself that she wasn't worthy of help, of love, or of a second chance. But in that moment, she realized something. Park Bo-gum saw her differently. He didn't see the broken, lost version of herself she had become. He saw the person she used to be and the person she could become again. She smiled at him, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. Maybe she could rebuild her life, step by step. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, "but I'm willing to try." And Park Bo-gum, without hesitation, took her hand in his. "We'll figure it out together," he said softly. "One day at a time." The days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Park Bo-gum watched her slowly transform. It was as if she was learning to live again, to rediscover parts of herself that she had locked away for so long. The art, the walks, the quiet conversations, they were all small pieces of the puzzle, each one helping her rebuild a life she thought she had lost. One afternoon, as they sat in a cozy cafe, Park Bo-gum noticed that something had changed in her. She wasn't the same woman who had been sitting on the street months ago, lost and broken. There was a spark in her eyes again, a glimmer of the girl he had once known. She was no longer defined by her past, by the mistakes and regrets that had shaped her life. "I think I'm starting to understand," she said softly, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "It's not about forgetting the past.
It's about learning from it and moving forward.
Park Bo-gum smiled, his heart swelling with pride.
You're right, he said. It's about learning to live with it, but not letting it control you.
She nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had control over her life again. The darkness that had once consumed her was slowly being replaced by light. It wasn't perfect, and there were still difficult days, but she was no longer drowning in her pain. She was fighting to stay afloat, and with Park Bo-gum's help, she was finally starting to find her way. As the months passed, their bond grew even stronger. There were still moments when the past crept in, when the weight of her struggles seemed too much to bear. But Park Bo-gum was there, every step of the way. He was her constant, her anchor in the storm. And slowly but surely, she began to trust again, not just him, but herself. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, Park Bo-gum looked at her with a quiet intensity.
"Do you ever wonder where we'd be if we had never lost touch?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
She looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful.
"Sometimes," she admitted. "But I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be. We're here now, and that's enough."
Her words struck him deeply.
It was true.
They had been through so much, and the years of separation had shaped them both in different ways. But despite everything, they had found their way back to each other. They were no longer the same people they had been in the past. They had grown, they had changed, and they had healed together.
"I never thought I'd be standing here with you again," she continued, her voice filled with emotion. "After everything, I never thought I'd be this happy again."
Park Bo-gum smiled warmly, his heart full.
"I'm just glad I'm here with you now," he said.
"And I'll be here for as long as you need me."
Her eyes filled with tears, but these were different from the tears she had shed before.
These were tears of gratitude, of healing, of finally accepting that she was worthy of love, of happiness, and of second chances.
"I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, "but I know one thing, I'm not afraid anymore." And that was the moment Park Bo-gum realized that it wasn't just about finding her again, it was about finding themselves again. They had both been lost, but they had found their way back to each other, and together, they could face anything that came their way. "You're stronger than you think," Park Bo-gum said, his voice filled with admiration. "And I'm proud of you."
For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled, truly smiled. It was a smile that came from deep within her, a smile that showed the strength, resilience, and hope that had always been there, buried beneath the pain.
And as the night fell, they sat together in the quiet of her apartment, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. They had both come so far, and they would continue to move forward, hand in hand.
Months passed, and with each passing day, Park Bo-gum and she continued to grow closer. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the fear of what the future might hold crept in, but they faced them together. The road to healing wasn't smooth, and it wasn't without its bumps, but every step forward was a victory. One day, as they sat together in the small park near her apartment, she turned to him, a thoughtful expression on her face.
"Do you ever think about the past?" she asked, her voice soft but steady.
Park Bo-gum smiled, looking at her as the sun filtered through the trees.
"Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't dwell on it. What matters is now. And what matters is us."
Her heart fluttered as she looked at him, the words resonating deep within her. She had spent so long running from her past, from the things she couldn't change, but with Park Bo-gum, she had learned that she didn't have to let her past define her. It was part of who she was, but it didn't control her. Together, they had learned to rebuild, to forgive, and most importantly, to love again, not just each other, but themselves as well. And that, more than anything, was the true miracle. As time passed, she became stronger, more confident. She started working on her art again, something she had put aside for so long, but now it was a way for her to express everything she had felt over the years. It was a small step, but each painting, each sketch, was a piece of her reclaiming her life, her dreams, and her future. Park Bo-gum continued to support her, always by her side, whether she needed someone to talk to or simply someone to sit with in silence. He had become her pillar, her constant in a world that had once seemed so uncertain. One evening, after a long day, they sat on her couch, her sketchbook open between them. She looked at him, her eyes soft, filled with emotion.
Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. For not giving up on me.
Park Bo-gum reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently.
I never could give up on you, he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. You've always been worth fighting for.
A tear slipped down her cheek as she smiled at him, and for the first time in so long, she felt a deep sense of peace.
She was no longer the broken, lost person she had once been.
She had rebuilt her life, and with Park Bo-gum by her side, she knew there was nothing she couldn't face.
You saved me, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. You gave me a second chance.
He smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face.
No, you saved yourself. I was just here to remind you of who you really are. The words lingered in the air, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to.
They both knew the journey they had been on, the distance they had traveled together, and how far they had come. And as they sat there, side by side, looking toward the future with hope, Park Bo-gum realized something. It wasn't just about finding his first love again, it was about finding love in its purest form. Love that was patient, love that was forgiving, and love that was full of second chances.
Whatever happens, Park Bo-gum said, his voice steady, we'll be okay. As long as we have each other.
She nodded, her heart full of gratitude and love.
Yes. We will be.
As the night grew darker, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared journey settling in their hearts. They had both been lost, but now, they had found their way back to each other, and to themselves. If you've made it this far, type second chance in the comments.